Hello, everybody. I am Rhonda Chapman, and this is a podcast about people, nature, and big ideas. I have really been looking forward to today's conversation with Mickey Fern. For the last 50 years, Mickey's been approaching this work at that really special intersection of people and nature with so much love and so much understanding. And so, some of the topics we're going to talk about today: the role of Black neighborhoods and their proximity to nature. We're going to explore how we need to be flexible in the ways we support people to engage with the outdoors. We'll talk about how racism and poverty require new thinking as we try to create lasting and meaningful relationships with the outdoors. It's something that a lot of folks don't think about. And so this is something TPL thinks a lot about. And I'm really excited about that. So Mickey's going to share his personal mission in life. He's going to talk about the connection with nature, his family, with his work, and the things that make him most happy in life. And I'll also say that this is a very personal conversation for me. Mickey has been a mentor and an advocate for me for many years. He is a Black man, and his insights have been invaluable to me as my journey in this space as a Black woman in the environmental world, thinking about conservation, showing up in spaces. And if I'm honest, sometimes I'm struggling, and this is really challenging. But this rich space of equity in the outdoors is my heart. And so it's Mickey's heart too. So you're going to get a chance to explore with us. I also wanted to share this podcast time with Mickey today because I think there's a lot of alignment between our shared values of being connected with land, to being outside, to being just in nature. And we've had a lot of hats to wear trying to amplify those values, and particularly by way of leading different professional teams and community teams and other entities through their diversity, equity, and inclusion work, not to mention their justice efforts. So we'll get into the conversation in just a second, but as a really quick setup to Mickey's background as a parks, recreation, and conservation professional, Mickey has worked with local, state, and national governments as the National Park Service's deputy director. He was the City of Seattle's director of innovation and the executive director for Neighborhood Leadership Program. He was the manager of Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative. He's the director of communication and citizen engagement at the Departments of Park and Rec. And he's now a professor of practice at NC State University's School of Natural Resources. And he's also a volunteer for the Trust for Public Lands National Board. So all that to say, Mickey knows a lot about space and the space of people and nature and big ideas. And that's why he's here. That's why he's my mentor, my coach, my friend. So let's go ahead and get started with this conversation. So I want to thank you for having a conversation with me. I want to thank you for being a mentor and a friend and a leader. As I said, I have several questions for you, and I know for every part of who we are, we have an origin story. Mm-hmm. And where we are today is often connected to that origin story. And so really curious about how you can paint a picture of a young Mickey Fern. And so thinking about where you grew up, mm-hmm. and so let's start there.
Yeah.
Where did you grow up?
I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1947, in segregated Chattanooga, Tennessee.
You know, the Trust for Public Land has an office in Chattanooga,
I know.
Tennessee.
They're doing some pretty good work down there. I sort of follow that.
I had an opportunity to go down there too, and I was really impressed. And I remember feeling like, I could actually see myself living in Chattanooga. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about what you grew up with, mm-hmm. in that space particularly, and I can reflect on the things that I observed while I was there. Mm-hmm. What do you think of, or how does it feel when you think back to your earliest memories in your connection with nature?
Well, the two are separate. And it's really interesting that you're asking me about my earliest memory, because I had to go through some training once in a place called Institute for Creative Development in Seattle, where they asked me to think of my original memory. It's the first thing I remember in my life, mm-hmm. right? And of course, it takes some time to filter through that. And there's some things that are fairly frivolous that I remember. And I remember being bathed in a tin tub. I remember not having a water. I remember the rag man used to come by and the watermelon man used to come by and all that stuff. But my first real memory was being out in front of my house. I think I was about 3 years old. I left Chattanooga when I was 5, and we moved to DC.
Okay.
So I'm about 3 years old, I think. I'm out in front of my house with my uncle. I remember holding his hand. My father wasn't there because he was in graduate school up at Howard University in DC. And this trash truck comes by, and there's some wadded up paper in the trash truck. And I say to my uncle, Uncle CH, what's in that wadded up paper? And he said, that's where they put bad kids. and that has affected my life for the rest of my life. I'm obsessive about relationships. I got obsessive about never being. It's the first moment I realized that I could be alone, that somehow I could be taken from something or something could be taken from me. And I spent the rest of my life trying to avoid ever being in the trash truck or to have anybody I know be in the trash truck. Oh. So I have this obsession about what it takes to make relationships work. And that has sort of defined who I am as a person and who I am as a parks, recreation, and conservation person.
So when you think about if you wanted to spring forward to another phase of your life, so now you're in DC potentially, you're older than 5, and at some point you have a connection with nature, but I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know where you were. Can you tell a story about that?
Well, I talk to my son periodically about who grew up at the best time near him. And what I liked about growing up is that there were 2 places that were the sacred spaces of children, the woods and the playground. I grew up on Ridge Road Playground. I don't think my parents ever came to Ridge Road Playground. They never came when we were playing in the woods. And the great thing about the woods is that you could make the woods anything you wanted it to be. You could make it a fort. You could make it you could just do whatever you wanted with it. And it was a great time to actually, and it was in Fort DuPont Park. So it was right across from DC. So my first sort of experience with nature is in DC, and it's in Fort DuPont Park. And we used to go to Rock Creek Park because we used to have picnics and family reunions at Rock Creek Park. But it wasn't like I was consciously interacting with nature. It was like it was there, and it was fun. And we used our imagination to make the woods whatever we wanted nature to be. The pretty much experience was improvisational, spontaneous, imaginative experiences in Rock Creek Park. And then right across the street at Ridge Road Playground was the recreation experience. That's when the sports and the arts and crafts and all that happened. And then we used to have to drive to Tennessee every summer to visit the grandparents. I told my son about this, that we're in a car, there's 5 of us. There's no air conditioning. We're having to make the food in the morning because we couldn't stop anywhere because of racism. It's like we could drive through these unbelievably beautiful areas, but we didn't stop anywhere. One is because there were gas stations that were segregated, couldn't use the restrooms, and because my father's generation had that fear of what happens to rural people in nature. But they took us to very, very pretty places. My parents ultimately both ended up with PhDs, and their idea of our recreational experience wasn't about taking us to nature. They would take us to really pretty places, and we would look at it and we would say, pretty. What they did is they made us go to the Smithsonian and read every card on the Smithsonian. We had to take turns reading the cards on the exhibits, and we had to stop at every exhibit, right? They took us to opera. They took us to ballet. They took us to, I remember seeing Marian Anderson and Odetta and Mahalia Jackson and all that stuff. They were giving us the whole cultural part of it because they thought that we needed to understand different things about culture because then that makes us more marketable. Now, that's not what they're telling us when we're young, but that's what their intention was. So the experience with nature was pretty much the experience in Fort DuPont Park until much later in my life.
It's funny to me because, first, let me just acknowledge the well-roundedness that you had. I don't think that a lot of people have an opportunity to have that well-rounded merging of nature and arts and culture on the way that you did. So it's really, I just want to give a shout out to your parents for doing that. The thing that I also appreciate is that I live right there off of Ridge Road. I live right by Fort DuPont Park, right? Yeah. And I know for me, you're telling a story of what it was like as like the two sacred spaces. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there were a multitude of children that were playing there with you. I don't know if it was just you and your siblings or if there was a lot of the kids from the neighborhood.
Well, it started out with my siblings and I, but because of the age difference, it turned out being the kids who were playing sports at Ridge Road Park. When we got tired of playing sports, we go to the woods. And we just go across the street and do something different. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know for me today, the community center is there, so it's expanded. The playground is now a beautiful community center.
Absolutely.
It's gorgeous pool and basketball courts, splash pads, and football field. But when I want to take my dog Buddy for a walk, we go on the trail. But we are the only people on that trail. And I'm wondering what happened between, if I could do quick math, the 1950s to today in that same neighborhood where there hasn't been a lot of displacement of the original families.
Right, yeah.
A lot of those homes are very much still intact, but for some reason, somewhere along the line, folks stopped engaging with that space. And I don't know what to attribute that to. I don't know why the trail is empty, why kids aren't playing on it like they did when you were a youth. And I'm really curious what you imagine some of the cause to be over the last 50 years.
Yeah. And as I said earlier, and this is a thought that's just coming up in my head, so I hope I have the words to articulate this. It wasn't like we were consciously interacting with nature. We just moved to a different place. And it wasn't like when we were in that place, we were seeing we were in nature and we're learning and there's that kind of stuff going on. So that's not what happened. And I'm kind of getting a little ahead of myself here. What I think people don't realize that every calculation that you make about using your free time, when you have some free time, you either consciously or unconsciously make a calculation of this thing called return on investment. The amount of time, energy, and money I have, what's the most I'm going to get out of this experience? And one of the things we haven't done is we haven't seen how poverty and racism calculate return on investment. And when you think about my parents being the director of Parks and Recreation in my house, my recreation activities, with the exception of the improvisational, spontaneous activities at Ridge Road and Fort DuPont, were their recreation activities.
Okay.
And so again, they wanted to go to plays and opera, and they wanted to go to Carter Barron, and there was a bunch of that stuff because that's what they enjoyed. I don't ever remember them even talking about going out into nature. So I think that as you grow old and as your recreation choices change, because Fort DuPont eventually became the place to go make out. So it ceased to be that recreation space where we're interacting with nature, and it's a space where we go park. we go park and kiss and do that kind of stuff. But I think that and I don't know if you want to talk about this right now, but there's this concept called biophobia, which is fear of nature. And E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, I think was the one who came up with this stuff. He said, first of all, it's biophilia. There's love of nature, and all of us have that. We cannot not have that. It's in us. And what I'm beginning to realize is not only is it in us, but we are nature, is that we are ecosystems as human beings. But when you calculate return on investment, what I find is that, especially African-American people, and it's different for Hispanics and it's different for Indigenous people, but for Native American people, the calculation of return on investment is based on the priority of our parents or what the environment provided for us. So if you look at Harlem, the recreation activities that people participate in Harlem, they didn't see snakes and, they didn't see little bunnies running around and that kind of stuff. Their recreation activities or recreation inventory, their culture is created directly by their interaction with their environment. And so therefore, the fire hydrant becomes a recreation apparatus. The abandoned car, chalk becomes hopscotch, right? A broom becomes a bat, all that kind of stuff. So they're involved in those kinds of things. And in those kinds of things, the satisfaction is immediate. It doesn't require any any type of effort. You just go out there and you play, and that's what you do. And so the neighborhood I grew up in was a really middle class community. So they were very educated people, but they were moving more toward acquiescing beauty on the cultural side of life than on the nature side of life. But I believe this biophilia is in all of us. All of us have an inherent love for nature, but in some ways it's been destroyed. So E.O. Wilson talks about this thing called biophobia, and biophobia is essentially fear of nature. And he assesses that we're all afraid of 5 or 6 things, and one of them seems to change periodically. I don't know if I'm going to think all of them because I'm under pressure here right now. So we're all afraid of snakes, spiders, darkness, closed-in spaces, and the 2 that show up and they change places sometime are blood and loud noises. Where everybody universally that they've measured across the world is afraid of those things. When the biophobia increases and you're afraid of more than those things, it's either because of an actual experience you've had that's a bad experience, a vicarious experience you've had, something you've heard about, right? Or something that you just make up about what happens in that experience. So when you look at the interaction of Black people with nature in terms of that calculation of return on investment, is that the biophobia has a tremendous impact on their appreciation of the resource.
So you're bringing up something that has been running through my mind lately in relation to how we build connections with people in nature, and that is the flexibility that you're talking about. You're talking about the creativity that young people tend to have, where they can make anything what they want it to be. They're very imaginative. And so, and you were referencing New York, and we're thinking about Harlem, and acknowledging that sometimes that concrete infrastructure becomes the source of recreation. So the broom becomes the bat, et cetera. And so you're pointing out the fact that people are different. We manage our physical body in a physical spaces very differently. And so while you and I might love nature and what it means to be in the outdoors as much as we can, we also have to accept that many people don't feel the same way.
Yes.
And so when we want to try to share our passion for the outdoors with others, we too, and definitely myself, I have to be flexible in how we do that. I have to appreciate a broom as a bat. I can't say it's not accessible, it's not inviting, I don't engender an experience of belonging if I tell somebody, you can't play baseball with that broomstick, you have to have a bat. That's very limited thinking on my part. And so, I think about it in terms of in my personal role. We got personal. You're talking about necking in the park, so I can go here. kind of in the name of oversharing. I think about how this conversation around flexibility and outdoor experiences can spill over into my dating world. And, I love nature. I love being outside. And so when, you get on a dating app or you're talking to somebody for the first time and they're asking me, what would I like to do for a first date? And a very standard response that people often give and expect is to go to dinner and a movie or one of the two or some combination. And for me, I want to go on a hike. I want to go on a trail hike. It doesn't have to be a significant elevation gain. It can be perfectly flat. I just want to be outside. And so when I bring this up to somebody as an idea for the first date, the level of resistance and skepticism is real for most of them. And so maybe that is a situation of biophobia.
So let me tell you about the biophobia, because I actually started looking at this when I was interviewed to be the deputy director of the National Park Service. In my interview, I think the chief of staff for the Department of Interior asked me what I was going to do to get more Black people camping and hiking, right? And I thought about this for a minute, and I said, well, I'm either going to get this job or not based on this response. And I said, I don't care nothing about camping and hiking, right? Now, that's not really true. I do care about camping. It's not on the top of my recreation inventory, but I do care about camping and hiking. And they said, well, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, what I want to understand is how, and we're talking about African American people again, because it's different for different ethnic and cultural groups.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to understand is how a group of people had a profound relationship with nature and the ancestral environment, and were in fact brought to this country because of that understanding of nature and their ability to grow rice in brackish water and to get pine tar out of trees.
Say
and to,
that.
Right. And if anybody's looking at this and you want to see about that, just watch High on the Hog, which is Netflix, which is about the influence of African agriculture and food on American cooking and eating habits. So I'm saying, I don't care about camping and hiking. What I want to know is how these people have this profound ancestral relationship with nature, this profound love with nature, how that changed into either fear of it or ambivalence, or just, I don't care about it. It doesn't have any interest to me. So I started looking at this. And when you look at separation from their homeland, when you look at the Middle Passage, where, they're spending all this time in the water, they get to Sullivan's Island, which is now designated a national park, by the way, which I didn't even know was a national park. I went down to
Solomon Island here?
Sullivan's Island. Sullivan's Island in South Carolina. Okay. It's across from Charleston.
Okay.
It's where 60% of slaves came into the country. I went down there to do something with Fort Sumter. And these white friends of mine said, are you going to Sullivan's Island? I'm saying, I don't have any idea what Sullivan's Island is. And they told me the story. And my wife and I went, and my wife don't cry, right? And we went to Sullivan's Island and we cried because we thought about these people coming from their homeland, having this horrible journey, the violence and brutality of that. Then all of a sudden they get dropped off at this place and they don't have any idea what it is, but in some ways, Sullivan's Island kind of looks like Africa. Mm-hmm. So they could have thought that they've been on this ship for all this time and now they're back, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the Middle Passage, then there's the what they call severe bloodline disruption, is that they destroyed anything that had to do with cultural and tribalism because they didn't want the slaves to be able to talk to each other, because if they could talk to each other, they could make plans and that kind of thing, right? Power. So they did this thing called severe bloodline disruption, which still affects Black families and the male role and responsibility in family. Still affects that today. Well, what happened then? So you've got this bloodline disruption, you got the brutality of slavery, you got, this horrible relationship with the land, because now this land that was life-giving is all of a sudden you're laboring in it, as they say, from no sun to no sun, mm-hmm. right? And they're laboring in it. And so there's nothing enjoyable about it. Then you have slaves, and we're not going to say being freed because they're still not free, but you have the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. And so now slaves are free to make choices and do what they want to do theoretically. But then we get Jim Crow, mm-hmm. then we get rural racial violence. Then we get the northern migration, where people said, I'm getting away from this hostility in the South. I'm going to move to the North. Mm-hmm. And by virtue of moving there, they had to live in the least expensive housing, because that's always what happens when immigrants come. They live in the least expensive housing. Mm-hmm. So they had to live in these ghettos in Philadelphia and New York and Chicago and Detroit and DC, which were void of nature. Mm-hmm. There just no nature there. You look out your window, you don't see a bunch of green. You don't see a bunch of trees growing. You see some birds. You see some pigeons. Mm-hmm. So at any rate, all of a sudden the northern migration occurs, and the urban recreation inventory is created as a result of the urban migration. So it's basically an urban recreation inventory in which the activities don't require any material equipment or supplies. As I said, the satisfaction is immediate. There's no deferred gratification. You don't have to walk 4 miles into it.
Well, so that's,
to see it.
But so going back to like walking 4 miles to have an experience, and I definitely want us to come back to some takeaways from some of the stories that you're sharing here. But I do want to go back to a conversation that we had before, because you were talking about these different points of disruption. Mm-hmm. Between the relationships that Black folks had or African Americans had with nature. And, we talk about your biophilia, my biophilia. But when we were having a conversation before, you shared that you never took your kids camping, which I think is still very interesting. Mm-hmm. And given everything that you know and that you continue to share with me, I don't think we've really ever had the same conversation twice.
Okay.
There's always more depth and more information coming from you. And so sometimes I feel like I should be recording every conversation so I can go back to it and have a transcript so I can continue to learn. But anyway, that's a sidebar. But I think you have grandkids now.
I have a 5-year-old granddaughter.
You have a 5-year-old granddaughter. And you didn't take your children camping. Fair enough. But I'm wondering if maybe you would introduce camping to your children now as adults and maybe introduce your grandchild to camping. Is that something that you can imagine happening?
Well, first of all, I think my reaction is that camping is not necessarily the defining experience when you talk about your relationship with nature. Walking in 4 miles, sleeping on the ground, eating dehydrated food, fighting off bugs, right? There is another experience that you connect people with nature that is not camping. My parents didn't take us camping for the reasons that they had, which had to do with their generation, the Depression and the Jim Crow stuff and the violence of civil rights and all that stuff. So they didn't, and they're the director of Parks and Recreation in my family. So now I'm the director of Parks and Recreation in my family, and my children get involved in what I turn them on to. And so my cultural tribes are basketball and cooking, right? And they eat well, and both of them now are really good cooks, and they do that kind of stuff. I took them to plays like my parents took me to. I sort of replicated the recreation inventory. Now, we would take them to beautiful places.
Of course.
We would take them to beautiful places. So it's like in Seattle, I mean, we would take them to Mount Rainier and Olympic National Park and to North Cascades Park. And, so they've been to those places to see beautiful places. And Seattle is beautiful of and in itself. So they have an appreciation of the beauty of nature. I just want to take them out there. Now, I should also tell you that I have trouble with swimming, right? And we know there's a whole history of Black people having trouble with swimming. Yes. So I can swim, but I get terrified when I'm in water over my head, right?
Yes.
Right?
I do too.
Yeah. But I said to my wife, who doesn't swim well either, it's interesting because we just went to the Galapagos recently and we're forced to snorkel. Terrifying experience.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
I get it.
So I made sure that my children knew how to swim. I made sure, because now they go to Hawaii. My son travels a lot, and they scuba and they snorkel and they get in deep water and they do all that kind of stuff. Because I was not going to create a situation where they could not access water sports. Imagine living in Seattle and being afraid of water and nature.
And it's also a safety issue, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you just never know when you find yourself in a predicament beyond your control and you're in a body of water and you need to survive. It can be a rushing river, it can be a pond, it could be a number of things. Or if, say, a child of anybody, either family or anybody, wanders into the water and somebody needs to help them.
Somebody got to go in
and you certainly don't want to be the one to have to watch them suffer. So I really appreciate that you're bringing that not only life-saving, but a life-sustaining opportunity to your own children.
And when you look at people's recreation inventory, so both of my children swim like fish. They're very good swimmers, but I still did not take them camping or hiking.
That's fair.
Well, now, but look, let me say this. So when I graduated from college at Cal State Sacramento in Parks and Recreation, my first job was this guy, William Penn Mott, who eventually became director of the National Park Service. He was state parks director. And he said, Mickey, I want you to find out how come Black people don't go camping and hiking. This was in 1970. Right? We're asking that same question today.
Yeah.
Well, I think that people who are comfortable camping and hiking have a level of comfort where they don't understand how other people might not feel the same level of comfort, and certainly not the same level of appreciation.
I mean, I fall into that camp. So in my family, I'm the Parks and Rec, director. And I still to this day consider myself a pretty active and avid camper. Although I confess I've only gone camping twice this summer. And still to this day, my own mother will say to me, are you still sleeping on the ground with them worms and all that dirt? I don't understand. And I have friends who immigrated here to the US who are from the continent of Africa who say, I don't understand why anybody goes to sleep outside on purpose.
Yeah, right.
when you have options. And
Yeah.
so I get it. I
Yeah.
get it. It's not something that has to be appreciated by everybody. But I want to try to take a quick little pivot and draw out some of suggestions for our listeners who might be asking some similar questions of themselves and of people that they admire or maybe even work with or work for. At the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about our living by Fort DuPont Park. And then, as you know, very close to Fort DuPont is the famous Anacostia River, right? It's famous for a whole host of reasons that we can come back to. And I also had mentioned how the trail, that Fort DuPont trail that Buddy and I find ourselves on is really underutilized. What I find fascinating about the Anacostia River, how people access it or don't access it, Fort DuPont Park, how people access it or don't access it. For the second year in a row, Washington, D.C. was rated the nation's best park system in the annual Park Score Index.
Well,
and so, but if you just go by the Park Score Index, which we're doing really great, but what you and I are seeing is something very different. And so just having a park nearby doesn't mean that folks are going to use it, right? And so there's something deeper going on where there's a relationship with the history and the culture. There's that relationship of racism that seems to be at the root of all of the bad things. A lot of things that we've already been talking about. So when we talk about creating meaningful relationships with the outdoors, that's TPL's mission, right? We have to recognize that some folks are still being left behind, and they're not being left behind as a result of biophobia. There's other factors that are leaving them behind. So based on the stories that you've shared, I'm wondering if you can provide some suggestions or recommendations to the listeners, definitely to me, but particularly TPL, who I'm certain is going to be listening in on this conversation. How might we better inform our engagement efforts, given that everybody is different, given that so many backgrounds and so many histories come into play? The nation is forever changing and evolving in a way that I think is quite beautiful demographically. But what can we do strategically or tactically to broaden the experiences of families or people in general to help encourage different choices?
Yeah. Well, one of my tenets in life, I have this in my mission statement in life, is you can't solve a problem until you realize you're part of the problem you're trying to solve. And so TPL and other conservation organizations and park organizations need to realize what part of the problem they are. So they realized that they were having a problem both with their workforces and with people making recreational choices. They're aware of the fact that there aren't a lot of people of color out on those trails, but they make an assumption that if we market them better or if we give people more information, that they will go. So here's what I found out is that people in the conservation business, and primarily white people, believed that putting 30 pounds on your back and walking 3 miles and sleeping on the ground and eating dehydrated food and fighting off bugs is fun. But when you look at the characteristics of the recreation inventories of Black people, that urban stuff where it's immediate, it's satisfying, you don't have to go nowhere, you need no material equipment and supplies, nothing can be in greater diametric opposition than those two things, the urban recreation experience and the nature recreation experience. So the first thing that has to happen, and this is what happens a lot, is that there are these 3 ways that people address racism. First of all, that the people who are victims of racism, we have to fix them, that they're having problems and somehow we have to fix them. We have to make them better because they're broken. And then we start messing around with racism on the edges. It's like, we really want to look like we're making some progress. So we're going to do some stuff, but it's not really going to make any difference. We're not going to change any of the systems or the processes that we use, but it really doesn't get better unless we really believe that we're all better off if racism goes away. So if conservation and parks and recreation organizations assume that camping and hiking is this consummate experience that everybody needs to have, then what they decided, and before I went to the National Park Service, they started doing a couple things. They started doing these play dates. And in California, it would be taking kids from Oakland to Yosemite, which is like 4 hours away, for the weekend. We take them for the weekend and they see God and they see some stuff that they've never seen before. And then we take them and drop them back in Oakland, right? Without any, and thinking that we have done, we have created the activity that is necessary to inspire them to appreciate nature. And when you talk to the kids about it, they said it was pretty, but they survived it. They didn't enjoy it.
And so that was purely transactional. There was no relational dynamic. There was no transformational dynamic. It was just checking a box.
There's no conversation about their reality and this reality.
Yeah.
Now there's an organization, North Bay, that I'm also on the board of. It's an environmental education school in North Bay, Maryland, where they only invite people to the school who are from poor school districts. Mm-hmm. And when they bring them to the school, this was really fascinating. Mm-hmm. So this is a beautiful place on the Chesapeake Bay. One of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Actually, I go there sometimes just because I just want to be there, right? And so the kids come on the buses. The kids come from these poor schools in Baltimore on the buses. And when the kids get off the buses, they're blasting like rap and hip hop when the kids are getting off the buses. And I'm going, this is just wrong, right? You're bringing people to this very quiet, peaceful, reflective space where we need to interact with nature and develop intimacy with nature. And you're playing this hip hop music. Their view is we're starting them off with something that they're comfortable with.
Connection.
Right? We're starting them off with something that they're comfortable with. That's and right. So they don't come in and automatically look at it and go, what I'm going to do with this?
Right.
You know, what I'm going to do with this water? What I'm going to do with this stuff? They come in and they make them comfortable. And then when they begin to teach them about nature, so they talk about invasive species, mm-hmm. and they talk about what an invasive species is. And then they get the kids to reflect on now, what's an invasive species in your neighborhood?
That's right.
What, and not talking about plants.
Right. I understand.
What's an invasive species in your neighborhood? So they're always connecting what they're doing in the natural space with what the young people are going to do when they go home. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's called a threshold experience. Now, interestingly enough, TPL some time ago, and I'm not sure who did it, but everybody alleges that it was TPL, stated that in order for you to incorporate a new recreation activity in your recreation inventory, you have to have 4 positive experiences with it.
I believe that. And I think that 4 seems to be a magic number for a host of things.
Yeah.
You know, when we think about the spectrum of being a novice to being an expert.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me tell you about my scuba dive, my snorkeling experience in Galapagos. Right?
Right.
So the first time,
right.
I don't know what this is.
Right.
I think when you get in the water, you got to swim. Right. You got to move your arms and your legs or you're going to sink. And I'm in like 12 feet of water and I'm looking at this going, and I'm actually doing what's in diametric opposition to what you need to do in order to be able to enjoy it. I watch these white people swim by with their arms behind their backs and they're just kicking and they ain't moving nothing. They just like moving through the water. Sure. And I don't understand how that happens, right? So then, so the first time I was terrified. Then I went back the second and third time. By the third time, I was kind of getting it.
Yes.
Because my fear was going away. Yes. My techniques were getting better. And then I could acquiesce with the beauty. But see, here's another problem. If you're angry or if you're afraid or if you're unhealthy, it's almost impossible for you to acquiesce with beauty.
Let me ask you one other question about that. I appreciate you sharing because I'm trying to envision myself, giving myself several times to try that and not just doing it once and saying, this isn't going to work for me. And we're talking about engaging with community. We're talking about unfamiliar territory mm-hmm. and comfort and safety. Mm-hmm. While you were going through this experience in the Galapagos, can you talk about what it was from the first time to the third or fourth time that inspired you to come back? And what I'm really getting at there, Mickey, is was there a conversation that was happening with the instructor? What was it that brought you that safety and that comfort?
Yeah, well, first of all, the fact that I went at all was based on the fact that my wife and I were only 2 Black people on the boat.
Okay.
And we were going to have all these white people going back to their neighborhoods and saying there were 2 Black people on the boat and they never got in the water.
Okay. So representation.
Well, I'm thinking, it's crazy that I'm going to put my life at risk because I don't want these white people to go back and say.
But it's about those false narratives and representation. Yeah. So say more.
All right. So then they do everything they can to make me comfortable. They put a shirt on me that makes me float. They put on a life preserver. You know, they give me all the stuff, and they say you can't possibly sink, right?
And so that,
but I don't believe that.
So with them giving you the tools, that is kind of the nature of equity, where we have to give people the resources that they need in order to be able to engage in an effort.
But my internalized oppression about it caused me not to pay attention to the tools because they were telling me what to do.
Okay.
And I was still doing what I thought I needed to do, which is to flail around and swim and to do what I could with my body to make my body float.
Even though they told
me to do something different than that. Okay. Pissed me off because my wife got in the water and she got to it right away.
Okay.
Right. She became like the white people who are doing this. And then
she was holding on to a different narrative.
Yeah, she got and she's crazy anyhow. She's real curious. And so anyhow, so I go back the second time, and I know that the people are talking about me, but I try to stay away from them so they don't see me struggling. But there was this one time that I was like snorkeling and I'm looking at the water, and all of a sudden I get my head above the water, and the boat seems like it's like 2 miles that way. And I'm going, oh, God, what am I going to do? But I still got to go back because I'm still holding this represent thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so then I start watching people, right? So not only do I have the tools, but I start watching people. Now, understand, when I'm snorkeling the first time, there's stuff under that water that's really interesting. I'm only paying attention to my survival.
That's right.
I'm afraid. I cannot fully engage in the experience because I'm terrified. Right. And therefore, I don't even have the same enjoyment of the experience that other people have, even though they've given me the tools, even though I know that if I got in trouble, somebody would come save me. I still have this narrative going through my head. So I go back the second time, and I do a little better. And by the third time I go back, I just kind of lay in the water, and I'm seeing stingrays and sharks and schools of fish, and I'm seeing all of that stuff. And all of that stuff was there before. So the third time it got better. And then I just elected not to go back the fourth time, because despite the fact that I really enjoyed it the third time, it wasn't enjoyable like enjoyable. I was not captivated.
You tolerated. Yeah. You survived.
I got through it. But I wanted to say the other thing that federal agencies did, and TPL might have been complicit in this. So not only did they do these play dates, but they did these work crews, right? Where they take a bunch of people from cities out and they remove invasives and plant indigenous species and build trails and bridges and that kind of stuff. And they're thinking that will show them God and that will get them back. But after that experience is over, there was no follow-up with that experience. Of all that core work that people have done, Student Conservation Association, the one in Atlanta,
there's SCA, there's also Groundwork.
Well, yeah, and
that's very much the same thing.
Yeah, I was on the board, the Greening Youth Foundation.
Yeah, and the Greening
Youth Foundation, they're kind of doing that work, but they don't have any idea where their alumni are. They don't have any idea where all of the people, and the same thing is true about North Bay and all those students, they had the experience and there was no way to follow up and keep the people engaged with the experience.
So what I'm pulling from in this conversation, we're talking about, some of the traumas that we might be carrying in our bodies, both known and unknown. We're talking about the different mindsets that we carry going into certain situations and what it means to feel welcomed, what it means to see something of yourself reflected in it. Mm-hmm. We're talking about representation. We're talking about myths that people share about certain groups of people, particularly Black folks. We're also talking about providing resources so that folks can have a particular experience. And we're also talking about the importance of continuity. Yes. So the sustainability of the efforts that we initiate with all of our incredible intentions. Mm-hmm. We go into these situations wanting to do the best thing for anybody, for these people in particular, these people who don't typically have access. But then we disappear. And I think that has a potential to re-traumatize and also diminish a sense of trust. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really happy to listen and experience these different stories. You've given different scenarios that all kind of evolve these same
they all come together.
Key themes. It's It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and when you look at the 10-minute walk, and I've talked to TPL about the 10-minute walk. Okay, so we have parks in proximity to people, and DC has more than anybody else. It's kind of not the same as Minneapolis or some other places in terms of the placement of their parks. You have these situations where you have a park, and you've heard me say this before, that when Nicholas was growing up and he didn't like broccoli, it didn't matter where it was on the table. It didn't matter whether it was on this end of the table or that end of the table. He wasn't touching it, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's not just creating the space and the laboratory for the activity to occur, it's creating a relationship with it. So my defining experience with nature came when I was 30 years old and my life had gone bad and I was trying to get my life back together. And I went to the state parks director in California and said, I need to go like join the Foreign Legion or something. And I went and spent 4 months in the middle of 15,000 acres of redwood trees. Yeah. And that's where I got it, because I began to understand fundamentally a bunch of things about nature. First of all, it doesn't want to hurt me. Never. And nothing that is smaller than you wants to eat you. Right?
They just want to see if you taste like candy.
Well, and then once they taste you, if you don't taste good, they just leave you there. But it was that 4-month experience immersed in nature and beginning to understand natural cycles and how nature is in us. I've talked to you about this revelation I've had recently, that we are an ecosystem.
100%.
And if we don't look at ourselves as an ecosystem, then we don't understand the ecosystem that we live in. It is a determinant of our health.
That disconnect can be literally deadly.
And the people in my zip code in Raleigh, North Carolina, Black people in East Raleigh live 13 years less than in the zip code 5 miles away because of park deserts, food deserts, lifestyle, just a whole bunch of things. So, okay, so we're talking about how to change this.
Well, we are. We've come up with you've done some really great framing around the direction that we can head moving forward and how we can engage in folks. But there are so many layers to who we are, and there's a lot around the various identities that we carry. So I want to ask you one more question, but before doing so, I want to make sure that I'm not skipping over one final gem that you wanted to share about change.
Well, let me say this. When I was on the State Park Commission in the state of Washington for 12 years, served 3 different governors. And when I first got on the Park Commission, the director of Washington State Parks was a botanist and a biologist. And I would go out into nature with him, and you would think we were in 2 different places. Mm-hmm. We're having the same experience in 2 totally different ways.
Yeah.
Right. He's intimate with everything in this space, every tree, every bush, every animal track, every sound. And he is so intimate with it that he's having a personal experience that's different than the personal experience I'm having. Despite the experience in Big Basin State Park, that I would go out to these places in the state of Washington and he would be talking about all the stuff that's going on. And all I could say is pretty.
Right.
And pretty ain't enough.
Right.
To get you to change your recreation inventory, you have to develop some intimacy with it.
Well, you're touching on something. Actually, that was a great transitional word to another thought that I've been contemplating. And again, going back to what I was saying previously around identity. And it might seem kind of sensitive, but I don't feel like it's too sensitive for you. And it's not something that I'm really qualified to weigh in on. But I do want to toss it out and see what you think, because I do think that there is something here. And that is that nature is very often framed as a very feminine thing.
Mother Nature.
We call it Mother Earth. We call it Mother Nature. And so I'm wondering whether that kind of framing is something that gets in the way of how men can interact with nature. I think about the Black women in my life, the people that I call my chosen sisters. Mm-hmm. And I'll say my family sisters too. Mm-hmm. We're nurturers, right? I think that feminine assignment or designation is applied to nature because it nurtures, mm-hmm. it provides, mm-hmm. It brings safety, mm-hmm. it brings comfort, joy. I mean, there's a whole host of experiences and adjectives that we can add to that. But I'm wondering, when we think about that kind of binary gender-based binary experience. If that has anything to do with, say, the Black men in my life that I'm trying to go on dates with to go outside, and maybe I'm turning this into something, but there's a personal intimacy on being on a trail by yourself and taking the time to literally smell the roses along the way and to stop and admire the animals and the wildlife and the flowers that the botanist can name. And it's something that can just be perceived as something that's very soft, right? Something that's very feminine.
Yeah.
And that perception can be really difficult to hurdle over.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think it's imperative to say that we're talking about Black people. And so for other people of color, it's very different.
Sure.
Native people have a profound ancestral relationship with the land, and they maintain that even through all the things they've been through. Hispanics don't have any trouble going to state and national parks. The problem with Hispanics is almost every campsite at every state and national park is set up for a family of four, because white people have a family of four, right? And so Hispanics go, but Hispanics travel in families. And I was talking to a Hispanic guy one time. I hope I can share this. And we were talking about the fact that these campsites are set up with families of four. And he says, we travel with four people in the front seat of the car. So all of a sudden you get these Hispanic families, maybe about 20 people in a campsite that's set aside for four people, next to campsite of white people who are coming there for relaxation and respite. Right. And the families are coming there to have a totally different experience. With immigrants and refugees, it's a different thing. So I want to make sure I'm talking about this, because when we're talking about these different ethnicities and cultures, there are different reasons why they have this stuff. So when you look at severe bloodline disruption, slavery emasculated men. Yeah. And almost in this society where men have to find opportunities to be men. Now, it used to be that you fixed the car, you went out hunting, and you did all that male stuff. And male stuff don't exist no more.
The gender normative
stuff that, or either it's been spread out or that kind of stuff. So I think I don't think it's the Mother Nature thing that's scary. I think we want to be in situations where we're in control. And men have a greater need for control than I think women do. I think it's very interesting that most of these organizations that are these conservation organizations that are trying to reconnect people with nature are run by women. Outdoor Afro is a classic case. Rue, and the Girl Hikes or something, I think, this here in DC.
There's Black Girls Hike, there's Girl Trek, there's a whole host of amazing leaders. There's Brown Girls Climb.
But it's amazing.
Melanin Base Camp. I mean, I could go on.
So we could get really deep into the gender implications of that. But if you want to go out somewhere where you're in charge and you want to show your manhood, right? Used to be you would go out and chop the wood and do all that kind of stuff.
You just touched on something. I'm going to come from a very genuine place. This dynamic that we're talking about just struck a nerve. So we just were able to very, very quickly name a handful of Black women-led outdoor organizations, right? Who are out here climbing, kayaking, biking, skydiving, all of these things. And very recently, there was a popular show, it's becoming popular, series on PBS about nature outside for Black folks and folks of color. And they gave that show to a Black man instead of all of these amazing women who have been leading the way in a very functional, loving, kind, organized way. And I am really in my feelings about that, how we have these dynamics at play where these incredible women were completely overlooked for the opportunity to shine their light. They gave this show to a man. And that is very disconcerting for me.
Well, we still live in a patriarchy. I mean, and so when you look at things that are in the foundation of America, this is going to sound like totally crazy. It's going to sound totally insane. I'm beginning to believe that patriarchy is as much of a problem as racism.
100%. That doesn't sound crazy at all. That's one of the smartest things I've heard you say. Because
racism is horrible. I mean, and it's in the foundation of American society. but patriarchy is also in the foundation of society. And so not only is patriarchy in the foundation of white men, it's in the foundation of Black men. And they're taking the same patriarchal approaches.
Well, that's the pedagogy of the oppressed, right? So when you look, and I'm not qualified, so we're going to go down a rabbit hole. So I'm going to keep us from doing that.
All right.
I agree. It's wonderful to hear you say that. So we're about to enter into the last stretch of the conversation, and I want to talk a little bit about outdoor education. We talked a little bit about this before, I think, but I know that when I was little, my school gave us 1 week of outdoor education. I think we were
all over the country.
Fifth grade, right?
All over the country. Fifth grade.
For me, it was like sixth grade camp, I think.
Yeah.
And so you get 1 week, and it's crazy to think about the central role that nature plays for me today and the amount of exposure and exploration I got as a kid. The amount of exposure and exploration I had as a child was what I designed for myself.
Yes.
That 1 week was simply not enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so I consider myself really lucky to have had that relationship on my own. And I don't think that a lot of children have the opportunity because they become outdoor children, especially today. We've got so much technology that's keeping kids from engaging outside. And there are also some that just didn't have a park nearby, whereas I had wetlands and all kinds of streams out in Montgomery County to play in. So can you tie this kind of experiential learning to our broader conversation about nature, meaning that when we come back to the ideas of being flexible in different ways, getting people outdoors, when we think about representation in, say, park spaces and the staff, the people who are engaging in community and providing these different points of education, how can experiential learning and exposure and experience and joy be tied to the way we are bringing folks into the workforce? So what role do you think outdoor education can play in young people's lives, and how can that be a pathway for jobs and vocation moving forward?
Well, and what you're talking about is how recreation interests become applicational interests. Right?
Say that one more time.
That recreation interests become applicational interests.
Okay.
That the things that you played at when you were a kid, right, somehow then maybe become a career option. But if you have not had that, everybody I know, and I was talking to somebody about this last night, every Black person I know who is accepting a leadership role in this space, they're in it because something weird happened to them. It's like me and my life went bad and I spent 4 months in Redwood Parks, or somebody got lost somewhere, or somebody went to visit their relative in Alabama. But everybody I know who is African American, who's accepted a leadership role in this space, are in that leadership role because their introduction was something weird. They didn't grow up thinking this is what I want to be. They didn't grow up thinking from the 5th grade, I think I want to be a park ranger, or I think I want to be they didn't grow up thinking that because that kind of stuff wasn't around them. So the problem here with me, and I'm beginning to actually grapple with this, and I'm not quite sure how to solve the problem, but we've talked about this. Flowers don't bloom in disciplines, they bloom in the spaces between the disciplines. Somewhere between the space of TPL, educational institutions, and parks and recreation organizations is the solution to this problem. But TPL can't solve it. Parks and recreation agencies can't solve it. Parks organizations can't solve it alone. It takes those people to come together. TPL has created the laboratory close to people where they can have experiences with nature that cause nature to be just a normal part of their existence. They've created an opportunity for that to happen. However, they can't make the people go.
Right. The
Department of Parks and Recreation can do that. The lack of agreement between, and here's a really interesting, the difference between learning and discovery. In my mission statement in life, one of the last statements I make is I am happiest when I'm in discovery with people I love. I love the process of discovery. I don't care about education. I mean, I do care about education, but what I'm saying is that what brings meaning to life is a kinetic connection to discovering things. So we have to look at these things as recreational opportunities when children are young. And if you look at school when you're young is recreational. There's a lot of play, right?
Used to be.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. There's a lot of play, but then as you get in upper grades, they just decide to suck the fun out of it. And in fact, we know at North Bay that we watch children learn math by being able to measure trees and shadows, using the environment to teach English. All right. So you're out there now. Let's write an essay about what you experienced, right? About math, about relationships. Redwood trees grow in families, right? They grow in families and they support each other, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're having those kinds of discussions in a recreational discovery context and it's fun, we know people learn more when learning is enjoyable than when it is mandatory, right? And so we need to get schools and parks and recreation agencies and other organizations together to create the learning experience. And we don't need to call it curriculum. Right. We need to create the learning and discovery experiences that instills this, that keeps the biophilia alive.
Yes.
So the biophilia is in them.
Yes.
Right. And if it's in them, then we need to provide the discovery experiences that sustain the biophilia and don't let the biophobia take over.
That's right.
Now, another problem with biophobia is media, right? And every movie that you look at, when teenagers go into nature, they die.
They are the first.
They die. They die, right? And so this isn't just a problem with people of color, by the way. You listen to the Children's Nature Network, and they will tell you that all children are being deprived of this experience with nature because of the screen thing. But then, of course, you ask yourself, how could we use screens to connect kids with nature?
I had a friend of mine who was talking about using, we were talking about TPL and building parks and what does it mean to make them relevant and exciting? How do you basically like make a park sexy for kids, you know, make it stimulating? And he was saying, why don't you all start investing in things like a Pokemon Go type scenario where kids have to, when they're engaging with their little mini pad computers or their phones, where you put different things for them to find inside a park.
There is some of that going on. And so, but the idea is to look at the threshold experiences. How do you create threshold experiences and pathways that allow people to overcome their fear, to reawaken their biophilia, to stay engaged with the thing? Because let's say that we do this, but people still go back to live in New York and they're living in those urban concrete environments that are toxic. How do we create something? And the other issue is we have a tendency to take people to nature, and then when they come back to their environment, they want to leave their environment. They want to get out of that environment because they've seen another possibility, but they don't come back thinking, how do I demand that my environment begin to reflect what I see in nature? How do I demand trees and green spaces and parks? And so how do I, rather than leaving my community, which means the problem continues to go on, rather than leaving my community and going somewhere else, how do I start making my community better? How do I get the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation to tear all the concrete? Well, we're tearing concrete out of schoolyards, right? And there are also recreation spaces that are concrete. How do we get them to tear all that concrete out and to put in livable spaces where we can grow things and we can learn from nature and we can do those kinds of things?
Well, that's awesome. I'm super grateful. I know that I have pulled a lot from you, and hopefully it's been stimulating for you. And it's reminding me of something else that is very, very important. As I mentioned, you've been doing this work for 50 years. You've been leading individuals and teams, agencies, administrations. It's just been quite a bit. And I've heard you talk about your own personal mission statement in life. And I'm not sure if it's related, but can you talk about how you've kept it going for so long and what it means for you to have an experience that's restful, and where you've been able to successfully find the balance of like digging into this vocation? So you've got your personal mission, you've got your professional mission. There's got to be a way for you to strike that balance. And I would love to hear kind of a closing thought.
Yeah, well, so my vision in life is to end my life with the same capacity to love that I started. I believe I was born with unlimited capacity to love. And I think life tries to do everything it can to make you mean, ill-spirited, and bitter. You have relationships that end, people die, you have disease and all. And life seems to try to do everything it can to make you mean-spirited and bitter. And I decided I'm not going to be that. I want to end my life with the same capacity to love that I started with. my mission statement in life is to prepare my children for the world and prepare the world for my children, which is what I've been able to do my entire career. Not necessarily being conscious of it, but I am raising my children, and I'm not making a distinction between my children and other children. In other words, I'm not saying I'm just doing this for Allison and Nicholas.
Sure.
That I've been doing this to try to create youth development programs that help young people be successful. But we also have to work on a world that provides opportunities and experiences for them to be successful. This has been hard. This has been, I mean, so you know, we're talking about it, and I believe one of the things about recreation is that sometimes things can be enjoyable now that weren't enjoyable when they happened.
Sure.
In other words, so we're talking about stuff that in some instances was fairly painful.
Of course.
Spending 4 months out in the middle of those redwood trees, never having that experience with nature. It was, for the first couple of months, it was like really, really hard. So we're talking about it in a way that we're talking about how, once I look back on it, now it's a recreational experience. It wasn't a recreational experience when it happened. But being at the March on Washington, my mother made me go August 28th, 1963, right out here. And there are a bunch of things that happened there to me. That's another defining moment of my life. But the thing that got in my central nervous system is that Martin Luther King's speech, the first 7 minutes were accusatory and damning and complaining about the problem. And the last 7 minutes were all about aspiration. It's all about what happens if we get this right.
Imagine another way.
So what keeps me going is being committed to trying to understand not what happens bad if we don't do this, right? Not looking at the negative, not looking at the pathological, but looking at the aspirational. What happens if we get this right? What happens when we don't need an environmental community? We don't need environment because everybody's an environmental steward. That we raise everybody to be an environmental steward, then we don't need an environmental community because everybody's taking their personal responsibility to do that stuff. But it's a matter of making nature and the environment important from birth, right? And getting people to understand that, again, you are nature, you are an ecosystem, and the quality of your life is totally dependent upon the space you occupy.
I love it.
Right? And so therefore, we have to work on the space we occupy, and then we have to work on ourselves to be able to enjoy that space.
Well, I think that is exactly where we need to close out this conversation. And I'm, again, so grateful for you, Mickey. And it just continues to grow. I can't tell you enough. I respect you. I admire you. I want to be you when I grow.
No, you don't. Well,
but
to be me when you grow up means you got to go through the crap I went through to get to where I am.
And I will have to go through it anyway.
And you're right.
And I'm already in it.
You're right. Yeah.
Thank you. This is just, again, a really important conversation for me to be having. This podcast is about people, nature, and big ideas. And we've talked about quite a few big ideas today. So thank you again. And I look forward to the next conversation.
It's been delightful.
All right.
Thank you.
Peace and love.